The grand ballroom of the Hartwell Music Conservatory sparkled like a jewel box that evening. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light across marble floors, and the air buzzed with the chatter of wealthy donors in expensive gowns and tailored suits. This was the most important night of the year for the conservatory, the annual fundraising gala where rich patrons wrote checks with many zeros to keep the music programs running. Isabella Chen stood near the magnificent grand piano, surrounded by a small crowd of admirers. At 22, she was everything the conservatory loved to showcase. Brilliant, beautiful, and from one of the city's wealthiest families. Her father owned a chain of luxury hotels, and her mother sat on the boards of 3 different arts organizations. Isabella had been playing piano since she was 4 years old, with the best teachers money could buy. Tonight she wore a stunning black evening gown that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. Her long black hair was pulled back, in an elegant style, and diamond earrings caught the light when she moved her head. She held a glass of champagne in one perfectly manicured hand while gesturing dramatically with the other. The problem with most pianists today, Isabella was saying to her audience, is that they simply don't understand what true artistry means. They can play the notes, sure, but they have no soul, no real understanding of the music. The people around her nodded and murmured agreement. These were the kind of people who liked to think they understood high culture, even if most of them couldn't tell the difference between Mozart and Beethoven, if their lives depended on it. Take this piece, for example. Isabella continued, moving closer to the piano. She placed her champagne glass on top of the instrument and ran her fingers across the keys without pressing them down. Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. It's one of the most challenging pieces ever written. Most pianists can't even attempt it, let alone play it with any real feeling. A young man named Tyler Wellington stepped forward from the group. He was about Isabella's age, tall and blonde, wearing an expensive tuxedo that fit him perfectly. His family owned several oil companies, and he'd been trying to impress Isabella for months. "Oh, come on, Isabella," Tyler said with a confident smile. "You're being too harsh. I bet there are plenty of people who could play that piece beautifully." Isabella turned to look at him, one eyebrow raised in the way that meant she was about to say something cutting. "Really? Like who?" "Well," Tyler said, puffing out his chest a little, "I've been taking piano lessons since I was 6. I think I could give it a try." The crowd around them grew a little larger as people noticed the conversation getting interesting. Isabella's lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You think you could play Rachmaninoff?" she asked, her voice sweet as honey but with an edge like a knife. "I don't see why not," Tyler replied, though he was starting to look a little less confident. How hard could it be? Isabella actually laughed out loud at that, a sound like silver bells that somehow managed to be both beautiful and cruel at the same time. How hard could it be? "Oh, Tyler, you really have no idea what you're talking about, do you?" More people were gathering now, sensing drama in the air. The conversations around the ballroom grew quieter as people strained to listen to what was happening by the piano. "Tell you what," Isabella said, her voice carrying clearly across the room. "I'll make you a deal, if you can play Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. And I mean really play it, not just stumble through it. I'll marry you." The ballroom went completely silent. Even the waiters stopped moving, their trays frozen in midair. Tyler's face went pale, then red, then pale. Again. "You're joking," he said. "Do I look like I'm joking?" Isabella asked. She gestured toward the piano bench. "Go ahead, sit down, show everyone how easy it is." Tyler looked around at all the faces watching him. He was trapped now, and everyone knew it. If he backed down, he'd look like a coward in front of everyone, who mattered in the city's social circles. But if he tried to play and failed, which everyone knew he would, he'd look like a fool. Well, I don't know the whole piece by heart," Tyler stammered. "Oh, that's convenient," Isabella said. "Don't worry, I'm sure everyone understands." Her voice was dripping with fake sympathy. "No, wait," Tyler said, his pride getting the better of his common sense. "I can play it, at least the beginning. I know the opening." He walked to the piano bench and sat down, his hands shaking slightly. Isabella stepped back, crossing her arms and watching with the expression of a cat who'd cornered a mouse. Tyler placed his hands on the keys and began to play. The opening notes of Rachmaninoff's famous concerto filled the ballroom, but it was immediately clear that Tyler was in way over his head. His fingers stumbled over the complex passages. The rhythm was all wrong, and he hit several wrong notes. In the first 30 seconds, he struggled on for another minute before his hands got completely tangled up in a particularly difficult section. The music stopped abruptly, leaving an awkward silence hanging in the air. "Well," Isabella said, clapping slowly and mockingly, "that was something. I think my marriage is safe for now." The crowd laughed, some people trying to hide their amusement behind their hands. Tyler's face was bright red as he stood up from the piano bench. "It's harder than it looks," he mumbled. "Everything is harder than it looks when you don't actually know what you're doing," Isabella replied. She picked up her champagne glass and took a sip. "This is exactly what I mean about people today. Everyone thinks they can do everything, but when it comes time to actually perform, they fall apart." She turned to address the larger crowd that had gathered. "This is the problem with our whole society now. Everyone wants the glory, but nobody wants to put in the real work. They want to look like artists without actually being artists." An older woman in the crowd spoke up. "Well, Isabella, not everyone can afford the kind of training you've had." Isabella's smile became even sharper. "Training only takes you so far. You need natural talent, real understanding, and the dedication to perfect your craft. Some people have it and some people don't. Money can't buy everything." This was rich coming from someone whose family had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on her musical education, but nobody in the crowd was brave enough to point that out. "I bet nobody in this entire room could play that piece properly," Isabella continued, warming up to her theme. "Nobody. Not one person here has the skill, the understanding, or the artistry to bring Rachmaninoff to life the way it should be played." She was really enjoying herself now, standing there like a queen holding court. The crowd was hanging on her every word, even though many of them probably found her attitude a bit much. "Art is dying," Isabella declared dramatically. "Real art, true artistry. It's disappearing because people have forgotten what it means to dedicate your whole life to something beautiful. They want instant gratification, quick results, easy answers. But real music, real art, requires sacrifice. It requires understanding that most people simply don't possess." As she spoke, she didn't notice the figure moving quietly around the edges of the ballroom. Robert Santos had been setting up chairs for a presentation later in the evening, his janitorial cart parked discreetly near the wall. He was a small, quiet man in his mid-40s, with graying hair and hands that showed the wear of years of manual labor. Robert had been trying to stay invisible, as he always did during these fancy events. He'd learned long ago that wealthy people preferred not to see the staff who made their comfortable lives possible. He was just supposed to do his job and fade into the background. But when Isabella started talking about Rachmaninoff, Robert's hands had stopped moving. He stood perfectly still, a folded chair in his hands, listening to every word. His dark eyes were fixed on the young woman by the piano, and something flickered across his face, an expression that was hard to read. "No one in this room," Isabella was saying, "no one in this entire building probably could do justice to that music. It requires a level of skill and soul that you just don't find anymore." Robert set down the chair very carefully and took a step toward the crowd. Then another step. His movement was slow and deliberate, like someone walking toward something that might explode if he moved too fast. "Real artists," Isabella continued, "are born, not made. They have something inside them that can't be taught, can't be bought, can't be faked. And when you hear true artistry, you know it immediately. It changes you. It makes you understand what music really is." Tyler had slunk away from the piano, still red-faced and embarrassed. The crowd was beginning to disperse, a little as Isabella's speech went on. Some people were nodding politely and looking for escape routes to the bar or the appetizer tables. But Robert kept walking forward, his steps steady and quiet. He was almost to the edge of the crowd now, close enough to see Isabella clearly, close enough to hear every word of her confident proclamation about art and talent and who possessed them. "The truth is," Isabella said, raising her voice a little to recapture the attention of her audience, "most people have no idea what they're listening to when they hear real music. They think they do, but they don't. They've never experienced what it feels like when someone truly gifted sits down at a piano and opens their soul." Robert stopped walking. He stood at the very edge of the 25 years ago, the name Roberto Santiago meant something very different in the world of classical music. Back then, he was just 8 years old, sitting on a piano bench that was too tall for him, his small feet dangling above the pedals, while his fingers danced across the keys with impossible grace. The old upright piano in his family's tiny apartment in East Los Angeles had seen better days. Some of the keys stuck, and it hadn't been tuned in years. But when little Roberto played, none of that seemed to matter. The music that came from those worn keys was pure magic. His mother, Carmen, would stand in the doorway of their small living room and cry while she listened to her son play. She worked 2 jobs, cleaning offices at night and taking care of other people's children during the day. But she had never heard anything as beautiful as the music her boy made. "Mijo," she would whisper, "you have a gift from God." Roberto's father, Miguel, wasn't sure what to think about his son's unusual talent. He was a construction worker with hands like leather and a back that ached from years of hard labor. Music seemed like something for rich people, not for families like theirs who counted every dollar twice before spending it. But even Miguel had to admit there was something special about what Roberto could do. The boy had never had a proper lesson, had never learned to read music the traditional way. He just listened to the old radio in the kitchen and somehow knew how to make the same sounds come from the piano. When Roberto was 9, their neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, heard him playing through the thin walls of their apartment building. She was a retired music teacher who had spent her career working in the public schools, and she knew talent when she heard it. Mrs. Rodriguez knocked on their door one evening, her gray hair in curlers and her bathrobe tied tight around her waist. "I need to talk to you about your boy," she told Carmen. Carmen's heart sank. She thought Roberto had been too loud, disturbing the neighbors with his practicing. "I'm sorry," Carmen said. "I'll tell him to stop playing so late." No, Mrs. Rodriguez said quickly. "You don't understand. Your son is extraordinary. He needs proper training, real lessons. What he's doing over there it's incredible." And so began Roberto's real musical education. Mrs. Rodriguez taught him for free, spending hours every week showing him proper technique, teaching him to read music, introducing him to the great composers. She had taught hundreds of children over the years, but she had never encountered raw talent like this. Roberto absorbed everything like a sponge. Within 6 months, he was playing pieces that most students took years to master. Within a year, he was playing music that Mrs. Rodriguez had to special order because it was too advanced for anything she had on hand. Word spread through the tight-knit community. People began coming to their little apartment just to hear the boy play. Carmen would serve coffee and homemade cookies while Roberto performed impromptu concerts in their living room, his small hands somehow managing pieces that seemed impossible for someone his size. By the time Roberto was 12, Mrs. Rodriguez knew she had taught him everything she could. She made phone calls, pulled strings, and called in favors from her days in the school system. She arranged for Roberto to audition for a scholarship program that could change his life forever. The audition was held at a fancy music school downtown, in a building that looked like a palace compared to anything Roberto had ever seen. The waiting room was full of other young musicians, most of them dressed in expensive clothes and carrying instruments that probably cost more than his family's car. Roberto wore his best shirt, the one his mother had bought him for his cousin's wedding, and his only pair of dress shoes that squeezed his feet. He felt completely out of place among all these polished, confident kids who looked like they belonged in a place like this. When his name was called, Roberto walked into the audition room on shaking legs. 3 serious-looking adults sat behind, a long table with notebooks and pencils ready to judge his performance. The piano in front of him was the most beautiful instrument he had ever seen, a gleaming black grand piano that seemed to gleam under the bright lights. "What will you be playing for us today?" one of the judges asked. Roberto's voice came out, as barely a whisper. "Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor." The judges exchanged glances. This was an extremely difficult piece, one that most adult pianists struggled with. They were expecting something much simpler from a 12-year-old, especially one who clearly came from modest circumstances. But Roberto sat down at the bench, placed his hands on the keys, and began to play. The music that filled the room was unlike anything the judges had ever heard from someone so young. It wasn't just that he hit all the right notes, though he did flawlessly. It wasn't just that his technique was perfect, though it was, remarkably so. It was something deeper than that. Roberto played with an understanding and emotional depth that seemed impossible for a child. Every phrase sang with meaning, every difficult passage flowed like water. The music seemed to come from somewhere deep inside him, as if he was telling them the story of his life through Chopin's notes. When the last note faded away, the room was completely silent. The three judges sat frozen, pencils forgotten in their hands. Finally, one of them cleared her throat. "Where did you study?" she asked. "With Mrs. Rodriguez," Roberto said. "She lives next door to us." "Before that?" "Nowhere," Roberto said simply. "Just at home." The scholarship was his immediately, not just a partial scholarship, a full ride to the most prestigious music academy in the state, with private lessons, performance opportunities, and a path that could lead all the way to the greatest conservatories in the world. The news changed everything for Roberto's family. Carmen cried for 3 days straight, tears of joy mixed with terror about sending her son away to live in a world so different from theirs. Miguel worked extra shifts to buy Roberto the dress clothes and sheet music he would need for his new life. The next 6 years were like a dream. Roberto threw himself into his studies with the same intensity he had always brought to music. He learned from master teachers who had trained at famous schools in Europe. He performed in recitals where audience members included professional musicians and wealthy patrons of the arts. By the time he was 16, Roberto was already being talked about as a future star. Music magazines wrote articles about the boy, genius from East LA who could make the piano sing like angels. Record companies sent representatives to his performances, talking about recording contracts and international tours. Roberto's technique became flawless, his musical understanding deeper than many professional pianists twice his age. He could play the most challenging pieces in the classical repertoire, and he played them with a combination of technical perfection and emotional truth that left audiences stunned. His family would come to his performances whenever they could, dressed in their Sunday best and sitting in the expensive concert halls feeling proud and slightly overwhelmed. Carmen still cried every time she heard him play, but now she cried in rooms full of strangers who paid hundreds of dollars just to hear her son's music. When Roberto graduated from the academy at 18, he had his choice of colleges. Juilliard wanted him. Curtis wanted him. Every major conservatory in the country was competing for the chance to continue his musical education. He chose Juilliard, the most famous music school in America, where the greatest musicians in the world had studied. His acceptance letter came with a full scholarship and promises of performance opportunities that most students could only dream about. Roberto moved to New York City with 2 suitcases and a heart full of dreams. He had never lived anywhere but Los Angeles, had never been away from his family for more than a few days, but music was calling him forward, and he couldn't imagine doing anything else with his life. At Juilliard, Roberto's talent shone even brighter. He was performing solo recitals by his sophomore year, playing with professional orchestras before he turned 20. His professors spoke about him in the same breath as the legendary pianists of the past. Everything was perfect. Roberto's future stretched out before him like a golden road, leading to concert halls and recording studios and a life dedicated to bringing beautiful music to the world. He had no way of knowing that all of it, every dream, every plan, every hope for the future, would come crashing down on a rainy Thursday evening in October, when a drunk driver ran a red light and changed his life forever. The accident happened just 6 blocks from Lincoln Center, where Roberto had been practicing for an upcoming performance with the New York Philharmonic. He was walking to the subway, his mind still full of the music he had been working on, when the speeding car jumped the curb and slammed into him. Roberto woke up in the hospital 3 days later. His mother was sitting beside his bed, her eyes red from crying. When she saw him open his eyes, she grabbed his hand and whispered prayers of gratitude. But when Roberto tried to squeeze back, he realized something was terribly wrong. His left hand wouldn't respond properly. The fingers that had once danced across piano keys with impossible precision now felt clumsy and weak. The doctors explained that his left hand had been crushed in the accident. They had done what they could, but the damage was extensive. Bones had been shattered, nerves severed, muscles torn. Robert's first job after leaving Juilliard was washing dishes in a restaurant kitchen. His manager, a tired-looking man named Dave, hired him without asking too many questions about his background. All Dave cared about was whether Robert would show up on time and work hard. The work was simple but exhausting. Stand at the sink for 8 hours, scrub plates and pots, load and unload the dishwasher. Robert's injured left hand ached constantly from the repetitive motions, but he needed the money. His family was struggling enough without having to support their grown son who had no other skills besides playing piano. At night, Robert would come home to his small apartment and try not to look at the old upright piano his mother had insisted on moving there. She thought it might help him heal, might encourage him to start playing again. But seeing it just reminded him of everything he had lost. For the first year after the accident, Robert didn't touch a piano at all. The thought of sitting down and hearing how broken his playing had become was too painful. Better to avoid music entirely than to face the reality of what he could no longer do. But music has a way of calling people back, even when they try to run from it. It started small. Robert would catch himself humming while he worked, his hands unconsciously tapping out rhythms on the edge of the sink. He would hear a piece of classical music playing in a store and feel his heart speed up with recognition and longing. One night, about 18 months after the accident, Robert came home from work and found himself standing in front of the piano. Almost without thinking, he sat down and placed his hands on the keys. The sound that came out was terrible. His left hand stumbled over the simplest passages, his fingers missing notes and hitting wrong keys. The music he had once played so beautifully now sounded like a broken machine trying to function. Robert slammed the piano lid shut and didn't touch it again for 3 months, but the pull was too strong. Music had been part of him for too long to simply disappear. Slowly, carefully, he began trying to play again. Not the complex pieces he had once mastered, but simple exercises, basic scales, children's songs. It was humbling and heartbreaking work. Robert had to relearn things he had known instinctively since he was 8 years old. His left hand felt like it belonged to someone else, clumsy and uncooperative. Some days he would practice for hours and feel like he was getting worse, instead of better. But there were tiny moments of progress too. A scale played cleanly, a simple melody that sounded almost right. These small victories kept him going, even when everything else felt hopeless. After 2 years of dishwashing, Robert got a job as a night cleaner at an office building downtown. The pay was slightly better, and the work was less physically demanding on his injured hand. He would arrive at 10 in the evening and work until 6 in the morning, emptying trash cans, vacuuming carpets, and cleaning bathrooms in the empty offices. The solitude was both a blessing and a curse. Robert had always been quiet, but now he went entire nights without speaking to another person. The only sounds were the hum of the vacuum cleaner and the echo of his footsteps in the empty hallways. But the night schedule meant Robert could practice piano during the day, when his neighbors were at work, and wouldn't be disturbed by his halting attempts at music. Hour by hour, day by day, he worked to rebuild what the accident had taken from him. It was slow, frustrating work. Some pieces that he had once played effortlessly were now impossible. The complex passages that required perfect coordination between both hands remained beyond his reach, no matter how hard he practiced. But Robert was nothing if not persistent. He began adapting pieces, finding ways to play them that worked with his limitations. He developed new techniques, different fingerings, creative solutions that allowed him to make music even with his damaged hand. After 5 years of night cleaning, Robert heard about an opening for a janitor at the Hartwell Music Conservatory. The job paid well and offered health insurance, but more importantly, it would put him back in a world of music, even if only as an observer. The conservatory was everything Robert remembered about the world he had lost. Elegant practice rooms, expensive instruments, young musicians full of dreams and ambition. Walking through those halls every night was both inspiring and heartbreaking. Robert's job was to clean the practice rooms after the students left, empty the trash in the faculty offices, and maintain the concert hall where performances were held. He worked from midnight until 8 in the morning, moving quietly through spaces that had once been as familiar to him as his own home. The students and faculty barely noticed him. He was just the janitor, invisible in his simple uniform, there to clean up after the real musicians went home. They had no idea that the quiet man emptying their wastebaskets had once been destined for greatness in their world. But Robert noticed everything. He heard the young pianists practicing in the late evening hours, their playing drifting through the walls as he worked. Some of them were good, some were just average, and a few were genuinely talented. But none of them faced the challenges he had overcome, and none of them appreciated how precious their healthy hands really were. It was during his 3rd month at the conservatory that Robert discovered the basement practice room. The room was small and cramped, tucked away in a corner of the building's lowest level. It held an old upright piano that was used for storage more than music. The top was covered with boxes of old sheet music and programs from concerts decades past. The room wasn't on Robert's official cleaning route. He found it by accident while looking for a supply closet, and he realized immediately that this forgotten space could be his sanctuary. Late at night, after he had finished his regular duties, Robert began slipping down to the basement room. He would clear the boxes off the piano, sit down at the worn bench, and practice. The old piano wasn't in great condition. Several keys stuck, and it hadn't been tuned in years. But it was better than the ancient upright in his apartment, and more importantly, it was completely private. No one else ever came down to this forgotten corner of the building. Night after night, Robert worked on rebuilding his abilities. He started with simple pieces, children's songs, and basic exercises. Gradually, he worked his way up to more complex music, always pushing the boundaries of what his injured hand could accomplish. The work was painstaking and often discouraging. There were nights when Robert would sit at the piano for hours and feel like he was making no progress at all. His left hand would cramp up, his fingers would refuse to cooperate, and the music would sound choppy and amateur. But there were other nights when everything would click into place. His hands would find their rhythm, the music would flow naturally, and for a few precious moments Robert would remember what it felt like to be a real pianist again. As the months passed, Robert's playing gradually improved. Not to the level he had achieved before the accident, that seemed impossible now, but to something respectable, something that could actually be called music again. He began attempting pieces from his past, the beautiful works he had once played, in concert halls for audiences of hundreds. Chopin nocturnes, Bach inventions, Mozart sonatas. Each piece was like visiting an old friend who had changed, but was still recognizable. Some pieces remained beyond his reach. The most demanding works, the ones that required perfect coordination and lightning-fast finger work, were still impossible. But Robert found ways to adapt, to find beauty in simpler interpretations, to make music that was different from his past performances, but still meaningful. After 2 years of secret practice in the basement room, Robert felt confident enough to attempt something truly challenging. He had been working on Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, the same piece that Isabella had declared impossible for anyone to play properly. Rachmaninoff had always been one of Robert's favorite composers. The Russian master had written music that was technically demanding but emotionally rich, requiring both perfect technique and deep understanding of human emotion. Robert had performed this particular concerto with orchestras when he was at Juilliard. Back then, he had played it with the confidence and power of youth, his fingers dancing through the complex passages without hesitation. Now, 20 years later, he approached the piece differently. He couldn't play it with the same technical perfection he had once possessed, but he had something else now. The wisdom that comes from loss, the depth that comes from struggle, the understanding that comes from having your dreams broken and slowly rebuilt by hand. Night after night, Robert worked on the concerto in his basement hideaway. He practiced each section slowly, carefully, finding ways to make his damaged hand work with the demanding music. Some passages he had to simplify, some fingerings he had to change completely, but gradually something beautiful began to emerge. Robert's interpretation of the Rachmaninoff wasn't the same as his youthful performance had been, but it was perhaps even more moving. Every note carried the weight of his experiences. Every phrase told the story of a man who had lost everything and found a way to keep making music anyway. The other staff members at the conservatory sometimes heard mysterious piano music echoing through the building late at night. The security guard would mention it to the maintenance supervisor. Robert stood at the edge of the crowd, his work gloves still in his hands, watching Isabella bask in the attention of her admirers. Her words about true artistry and dedication cut deep, not because they were wrong, but because they were so completely removed from the reality of what music actually meant to people like him. She spoke about sacrifice as if she knew what it meant, this young woman who had been handed every advantage money could buy. She talked about soul and understanding while surrounded by people who saw music as decoration for their wealthy lives, rather than as something essential and life-giving. Robert had spent the last 25 years learning what real sacrifice looked like. Not the sacrifice of giving up parties to practice piano, but the sacrifice of giving up everything you ever dreamed of and finding a way to keep going anyway. As Isabella's speech wound down and the crowd began to disperse, Robert felt something stirring inside him that he had thought was long dead. It wasn't anger exactly, though there was some of that. It wasn't pride, though he felt a flicker of that too. It was something deeper. A quiet voice that said it was time to stop hiding. For years, Robert had been content to practice in secret, to rebuild his abilities for no audience except himself. Music had become something private and personal, a way of healing that didn't require anyone else to witness or understand. But watching Isabella dismiss Tyler so cruelly, listening to her pronounce judgment on the musical abilities of everyone in the room, Robert felt a pull toward the beautiful grand piano that dominated the center of the ballroom. His feet began moving before his brain had fully decided what he was going to do. One step, then another, carrying him away from the safety of the shadows and toward the bright lights where Isabella held court. People were starting to drift away from the piano area, heading toward the bar or the tables of expensive appetizers. The drama of Tyler's failed performance was over, and the party was returning to its normal rhythm of polite conversation and networking. Isabella had turned away from the piano, accepting compliments from an elderly couple who were praising her high standards and her commitment to excellence. She was glowing with satisfaction, clearly pleased with how she had handled the situation. But as Robert approached, still moving with the quiet, careful steps of someone who had spent years trying to be invisible, Isabella caught sight of him in her peripheral vision. She turned slightly, her expression shifting from satisfied smugness to mild confusion. Here was this small, middle-aged man in a janitor's uniform, walking toward her with a strange intensity in his dark eyes. Isabella's first instinct was annoyance. Surely this was someone who was going to ask her to move so he could clean something, or who had some other menial task that couldn't wait until after the gala. "Excuse me," Isabella said, her voice carrying the automatic dismissiveness she used with service workers. "We're having a conversation here. Perhaps you could come back later?" Robert stopped walking, standing now about 10 feet from the piano. The few people who were still gathered around Isabella followed her gaze, looking at this unexpected interruption with varying degrees of curiosity and irritation. "I'm sorry," Robert said quietly, his voice carrying a slight accent that spoke of his childhood in East Los Angeles. "I don't mean to interrupt." "Then don't," Isabella said with a bright, fake smile. "We can move out of your way if you need to clean something." But Robert didn't move toward any cleaning supplies. Instead, he took another step toward the piano, and something in his demeanor made the remaining crowd members pause their conversations. "That piece you mentioned," Robert said, his voice still quiet but somehow carrying clearly across the space between them. "Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. Isabella's eyebrows rose. "What about it?" "You said no one in this room could play it properly," Robert continued. His hands were no longer holding his work gloves. At some point, he had dropped them, without noticing. "You said it required a level of skill and soul that people don't have anymore." The condescension in Isabella's smile became more pronounced. "That's right. It's an extremely difficult piece that requires years of training and natural talent. Not something that—" She gestured vaguely at his uniform, making her meaning clear without saying it directly. Robert nodded slowly, as if considering her words. "I understand why you would think that." Something in his tone made Isabella look at him more carefully. There was something different about this janitor, something that didn't quite fit with her assumptions about who he was supposed to be. "Think what?" she asked. "That music belongs only to people like you," Robert said. His voice was still quiet, but there was a strength in it now that hadn't been there before. "People who can afford expensive schools and private teachers and beautiful instruments." The few remaining crowd members were now paying full attention to this unusual conversation. Isabella's friends looked uncomfortable. This was not the kind of interaction they were used to having with the help. "Music is for everyone who has the talent and dedication to pursue it properly," Isabella said, her tone becoming sharper. "But it does require proper training, which costs money. That's just reality." "Yes," Robert agreed. "Training is important, but sometimes the most important lessons come from places you don't expect." He took another step toward the piano, and now Isabella was starting to look genuinely annoyed rather than just dismissive. "Look," she said, "I don't know what point you're trying to make here, but this is a private party for conservatory donors. I'm sure you have work to do." "I do," Robert said simply. "But first I was wondering if I could ask you a question." Isabella glanced around at her friends, clearly looking for support in dealing with this strange situation. Tyler, still smarting from his own humiliation, was watching with interest to see how Isabella would handle this new challenge. "What kind of question?" Isabella asked. Robert was very close to the piano now, close enough to reach out and touch the gleaming black surface. "You said that when you hear true artistry you know it immediately, that it changes you, that it makes you understand what music really is." "That's right," Isabella said, though she was beginning to sound less certain. "So if someone sat down at this piano and played Rachmaninoff the way it was meant to be played," Robert continued, "you would recognize it? You would know that what you were hearing was real?" "Of course I would," Isabella said, but something in her voice suggested she was starting to understand where this conversation was heading. Robert reached out and ran his fingers lightly across the piano's surface, not touching the keys but just feeling the familiar shape of the instrument he had loved his entire life. "The thing about music," he said, still looking at the piano rather than at Isabella, "is that it doesn't care how much money you have. It doesn't care what school you went to or what clothes you wear or what your last name is." He turned to look at Isabella directly, and she was startled by the intensity she saw in his eyes. "Music only cares about truth," Robert said, "and sometimes the deepest truth comes from the people you least expect to have it." The ballroom had grown quiet around them. Other conversations had stopped as people became aware that something unusual was happening by the piano. Even the waiters had slowed their movements, sensing drama in the air. Isabella's face had gone pale. "What are you saying?" Instead of answering, Robert pulled out the piano bench and sat down. His movements were careful and deliberate, like someone performing a ritual that required perfect precision. "Wait," Isabella said, her voice sharper now. "You can't just—" But Robert was already placing his hands on the keys, and the sight of his scarred left hand settling into position with practiced familiarity made Isabella's words die in her throat. For a moment, Robert just sat there, his hands resting lightly on the keys, his eyes closed. The ballroom was completely silent now, everyone watching this unexpected scene unfold. When Robert opened his eyes, they were bright with something that might have been tears, or might have been joy, or might have been the kind of pain that comes from remembering something beautiful that you thought was lost forever. And then he began to play. The opening notes of Rachmaninoff's piano, Concerto No. 2, filled the ballroom with a power and beauty that made every other sound in the world seem to disappear. This wasn't the stumbling amateur attempt that Tyler had made earlier. This was music played by someone who understood every note, every phrase, every emotion that the composer had poured into the piece. Robert's damaged left hand moved across the keys with grace that seemed impossible given its obvious injuries. His technique wasn't the flashy, perfect execution that Isabella was used to hearing from her fellow students. Instead, it was something deeper, playing that came from understanding rather than just skill, music that told a story rather than just showing off. The melody soared and wept, danced and mourned, carrying with it all the years of loss and longing that Robert had poured into his secret practice sessions. This was Rachmaninoff, played by someone who had lived through heartbreak and found a way to transform it into something beautiful. Isabella stood frozen, her mouth slightly open, watching this impossible scene unfold. The quiet janitor she had barely noticed was playing one of the most challenging pieces in the classical repertoire, with a skill, and the silence that followed Robert's performance seemed to stretch on forever. Nobody in the ballroom moved, nobody spoke, nobody even seemed to remember how to breathe. The beauty of what they had just witnessed had left them all stunned, as if they had just seen something that shouldn't have been possible. Isabella stood closest to the piano, tears streaming down her face, staring at this man who had just shattered every assumption she had ever made about music, about talent, and about who deserved to be heard. Her expensive makeup was ruined, her perfect composure completely destroyed, but for the first time in her life, she didn't care how she looked. Robert sat quietly at the piano bench, his scarred hands still resting on the keys, looking more peaceful than he had felt in 25 years. He had done something he never thought he would do again. He had shared his music with an audience, and they had truly heard him. Finally, someone in the crowd began to clap. It was slow applause at first, hesitant as if the person wasn't sure whether it was appropriate to break the spell that Robert's music had cast over the room. But then others joined in, and within moments the entire ballroom was erupting in thunderous applause. People were standing now, giving Robert the kind of ovation usually reserved for world-famous soloists performing in major concert halls. Men, in expensive tuxedos, wiped their eyes with silk handkerchiefs. Women in designer gowns applauded until their hands hurt, many of them crying openly. Robert stood up from the piano bench slowly, looking overwhelmed by the response. He had grown so used to playing for an audience of one, himself, that being the center of attention for hundreds of people felt almost surreal. "Who are you?" Isabella whispered, her voice barely audible over the continuing applause. Where did you learn to play like that?" Robert looked at her for a long moment before answering. "My name is Robert Santos," he said simply. "And music has been my life for as long as I can remember." The applause was beginning to die down, but people weren't moving away from the piano. They were pressing closer, all wanting to get a better look at this mysterious janitor who had just delivered one of the most moving musical performances any of them had ever witnessed. "But you're—" Isabella started to say, then stopped herself. She had been about to say, "just a janitor," but the words felt cruel and stupid in her mouth. This man was clearly much more than his uniform suggested. "I work here," Robert said, understanding what she was trying to ask. "I clean the practice rooms, empty the trash, maintain the building. It's honest work, and I'm grateful for it." An older woman pushed through the crowd, moving with the determined energy of someone who was used to getting her way. She was elegantly dressed in a navy blue gown with silver hair pulled back in a sophisticated style and eyes that seemed to see everything. "Excuse me," she said, addressing Robert directly while the crowd made room for her. "Did you say your name was Santos?" "Yes, ma'am," Robert replied, looking puzzled by her intensity. The woman studied his face carefully, as if trying to solve a puzzle. Not Roberto Santos? From East Los Angeles? Robert's eyes widened in surprise. Yes, but how do you know that name? A slow smile spread across the woman's face. Because, my dear man, I am Professor Elena Marchetti. I founded this conservatory 40 years ago, and I have an excellent memory for exceptional talent. She reached into her small evening purse and pulled out a pair of reading glasses, putting them on to examine Robert more closely. I never forget a name or a face when it comes to truly gifted musicians. Roberto Santos. You were admitted to Juilliard in 1999 with a full scholarship. You were being called the most promising young pianist of your generation. The crowd around them had grown completely quiet again, everyone straining to hear this unexpected conversation. Isabella felt like she was witnessing something important, though she didn't fully understand what was happening. Then you disappeared, Professor Marchetti continued. Just vanished from the classical music world without a trace. We all wondered, what had happened to you? Robert's face was a mixture of pain and surprise. You remember me? Remember you? My dear boy, I have recordings of your performances from when you were 18. I used to play them for my students as examples of what perfect musical interpretation sounded like. She gestured toward the piano. What I just heard was even more beautiful than those old recordings. You've grown as an artist, even after all these years. Isabella felt like the ground was shifting beneath her feet. This quiet janitor, who she had barely noticed for months, was Roberto Santos, a name that Professor Marchetti spoke with the kind of reverence usually reserved for the greatest musicians in history. What happened? Professor Marchetti asked gently. Why did you leave music? Robert was quiet for a long moment, looking down at his left hand. There was an accident, he said finally. My hand was badly injured. I couldn't play the way I used to. But you obviously can play, Professor Marchetti said. What I just heard was extraordinary. It took me 25 years to relearn how to make music with this hand, Robert said, holding up his scarred left hand for everyone to see. The doctor said I would never play professionally again. They were right in a way. I can't play with the same technical perfection I had when I was young. Technical perfection, Professor Marchetti said with a slight smile, is overrated. What you just played had something much more valuable. It had heart, soul, life experience. It had truth. Isabella stepped forward, her voice shaky with emotion. I need to apologize, she said. What I said earlier about people not having the skill or the soul to play real music, I was wrong. I was so wrong. Robert looked at her, with kindness in his eyes. You weren't entirely wrong, he said. Real music does require dedication and understanding, but those things can come from places you might not expect. I've been playing piano for 18 years, Isabella said, her voice barely above a whisper. I've had the best teachers, the best instruments, every advantage money could buy. But I've never played anything that sounded like what you just played. I've never even heard anything like it. That's because you've been focused on playing the notes correctly, Professor Marchetti said, though her tone was gentle rather than critical. Roberto here has learned to play the music behind the notes. There's a difference. Tyler, who had been standing at the edge of the crowd looking embarrassed and forgotten, suddenly spoke up. How long have you been working here? 5 years, Robert replied. 5 years, Tyler repeated, shaking his head in amazement. You've been here for 5 years and none of us knew. I prefer to keep to myself, Robert said. I never expected this. He gestured at the crowd still gathered around the piano. Professor Marchetti was studying Robert with the intense focus of someone making an important decision. Roberto, she said finally, would you be interested in returning to music? Not as a janitor who plays piano in secret, but as a teacher, a performer, a member of our faculty. The suggestion hit Robert like a physical blow. I don't think I'm not qualified to teach in a place like this. Not qualified? Professor, Marchetti laughed. My dear man, you just gave the most moving musical performance this building has seen in years. You've overcome obstacles that would have destroyed most people's relationship with music entirely. You've found ways to create beauty, despite physical limitations that should have made it impossible. If that doesn't qualify you to teach, I don't know what does. Isabella wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing her makeup even more. Would you consider teaching me? She asked hesitantly. I mean, if you become a faculty member. I feel like I've been playing piano my whole life without really understanding what music is supposed to be. Robert looked at this young woman who had spent the evening displaying her arrogance and superiority, and he saw something in her face that reminded him of himself at that age, talented, ambitious, but missing some essential understanding about what music really meant. Music isn't about being perfect, he said to her. It's about being honest. It's about taking all the experiences you've had, the good ones and the bad ones, the joy and the pain, and finding a way to express them through sound. But how do you do that? Isabella asked. How do you make music that connects with people the way yours just did? You live, Robert said simply. You experience life fully, with all its ups and downs. You let yourself feel things deeply, even when it hurts. And then you bring all of that to the piano with you. Professor Marchetti clapped her hands together, clearly having made up her mind. This is settled then. Roberto, I'm offering you a position on our faculty, effective immediately. We'll start you as an artist in residence with opportunities to perform and to teach master classes. Robert looked stunned. Professor, I appreciate the offer, but I don't have any teaching credentials, any formal qualifications. Nonsense, Professor Marchetti said firmly. Your qualifications are in your hands and in your heart. Everything you just demonstrated with that performance, that's what we want our students to learn. The crowd around them was still listening to every word, and many people were nodding in agreement with Professor Marchetti's offer. They had all been moved by Robert's performance, and they could see the wisdom in bringing him into the conservatory's official family.